Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy and honored to bring the conversation I had with Paul North and Paul Reitter, the two Pauls. Paul North is chair and professor of Germanic languages and literature at Yale University. He has a PhD in comparative literary studies with a German concentration from Northwestern University. And his main research areas are in critical theory, history of philosophy, and European literature. Paul Reitter is professor in Germanic languages and literatures at The Ohio State University. He has a PhD in German studies from the University of California, Berkeley. And his main research areas are in critical theory, German Jewish culture, and the history of higher education. And they are the editors and translators of the newest English translation of Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. I think it has to say that in the 19th and 20th century, there's a handful of monumental, influential thinkers for their thoughts and their work. I would put Charles Darwin in that category. I would put Sigmund Freud in that category. And I would put Karl Marx in that category. You can love these guys, you can hate them, you can agree with them, you can disagree with them, but their impact has been tremendous. And it's just fantastic that the wonderful Princeton University Press has a new English translation. I think it's for 40 or 50 years since the last one of such a huge work. I have to say, I haven't, it was a reread for me, and I haven't read it in a while. I did this project a long time ago where I read Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, and then I read Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Just kind of was overwhelmed. But I remember the writing was a little bit clunky in some parts, and it was just felt a little antiquated. And this new translation makes it much more readable, much more fluid. It is analytical, it is technical, but it is just a wonderful translation. So we start the conversation and we talk about their process, editing and translating Capital. Who did what, who made the edits here, just kind of get the feeling of what their kind of dynamic was. We talk about the second German edition as being the main edition that they translated from. And this was the last one that Karl Marx was involved with. And then we also talk about various English and French translations. And we also talk a little bit about some of the motivations for Marx, a little bit like a quasi-psychological profile. Why did he write Capital? What was his ideas for doing this? We also talk about his thoughts and his impact and some of the differences there. We talk about the main thesis in Capital. What is this big book all about? What is he trying to say? And some of the interactions he had with Hegel's thought. We, of course, talk about his labor theory of value, his legacy, and many other topics. I have to say, this was such a treat. I really enjoyed the conversation, talking about translation, talking about process, really talking about the substance of Capital. And both Pauls were just tremendous. They were wonderful. They're obviously very brilliant, and it was such a fabulous conversation. Quick edit at the end. Paul Reitter had to jump, so Paul North landed us at the end. So if you don't hear Reiter's comments towards the end, this is the last 2 or 3 minutes of the conversation. He had to jump off early, so that's why you don't hear him there. But both of these gentlemen were just wonderful in the conversation. I was very honored and privileged to have both of them on. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So get on the Substack. Please subscribe. You can get this stuff in your inbox directly. Of course, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. If you like this conversation, there's a back catalog with many other conversations like this on translation, on literary criticism, on theory, so many philosophy, so many different episodes with so many wonderful guests. So if you like this one, if you kind of look around in the previous episodes, you'll find something else you like on there. And of course, if you like this, tell your friends. Tell them, hey, there's a lot of podcasts out there, but this one's not too bad. So that's much appreciated. And now I bring you Paul North and Paul Reitter. I am here with two wonderful guests. I'm here with two Pauls. I'm here with Paul Reitter and Paul North. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's a big honor.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we are gathered here today to talk about Capital, Volume 1 by Karl Marx. You have, Reitter, you have translated this, and both of you have edited this. So we'll talk all about it. It's one of the newer English translations. We'll talk about some of the translation pieces of it, which version you use and all that in a bit. Before we do, we can start. We can go alphabetical, I guess, to make it easy. So, North, you can tell us, who you are professionally, academically, all the relevant details, and then after, Reitter, you can go in with the same.
I teach critical theory at Yale over here on the East Coast in the U.S., and I have written on figures who go against the grain: Kafka, Walter Benjamin, Marx, Hegel, Kant, all of these big, heavy-duty philosophy characters. And I was privileged to work with Paul Reitter on this translation.
Yeah, that's nice. Reitter?
I teach at Ohio State University. I've been here for over 20 years now. I'm speaking to you from Columbus, Ohio, and I work on a couple of different things: German Jewish literature and culture. I have kind of a thing for sarcastic, ironic German Jewish authors with a deconstructive intelligence and maybe also something of a self-destructive streak. Solomon Maimon, Karl Kraus, Heinrich Heine, and of course Marx. I am a translator. I also write about translation, and I work on the history of higher education. And it was really a great pleasure to work with this project on Paul North. On Paul North. Yeah, I might be working on a Paul North project, but for now I'm working with Paul North.
That's great. That's great. So I guess, tell a few things you guys can tell me about your guys' working relationship. So, Reitter, you did all the translation on this from the German, or North, you got in there and said, well, I don't know if I'd use that adjective, or how did you guys do the translation bit of it, I guess?
So I suppose on the cover it says the translation is by Paul Reitter, and there is some sense to that because I took the lead on the translation, but all parts of the project were collaborative, and there was a lot of collaboration here too. We went back and forth on many translation choices. There were places where I got stuck. I was asking myself, what does Marx mean here? What is he saying? And I would confer with North, and North would offer a lot of great insight. And so his fingerprints are all over the translation, not just the frame around the translation, the notes, appendices, and front matter.
I guess what about the editing? Both of you are listed as that, but I mean, how did you, North, how did you, kind of with the notes and the appendices and then helping with translation, what was your kind of, I guess, big chunk of it that you were doing? And how would you describe the collaboration with Reitter?
First, I should say it's like handling the world's baby. The world has this baby as Marx's Capital, and everyone places a lot of hopes in it. And then you decide you're going to pick it up and do more than change the diaper. You're going to kind of rearrange its face. So we were very aware of the responsibility we had to previous translators, previous interpreters, to Marxists, to revolutionaries, to people's hopes. You can't take responsibility for all of that. Obviously, it's absurd. But because of the importance of every choice, we really spent a lot of time researching. We were lucky because we have 150 years of scholarship to deal with. And we have the amazing editors of the German critical edition who chased down a lot of the references, clarified the German, could talk about where it came from in English political economy. in such a way that we could make really informed choices. And we discussed this, and Paul Reitter is a very, very difficult human being, but I put up with him for this. I have to say he has no sense of humor. He takes everything as though it were written in stone. And no, to be honest, we had a really fun time working with Marx. And Marx, as you will see if you take a look at this translation, is hilarious and polemical, and he gets angry and he tells stories. And there's few texts that are this fun to work with.
Yeah, that's nice. I mean, I guess I have to ask. I mean, you kind of alluded to it there. I mean, were you all nervous, or maybe initially, and then as you just kind of get kind of knee deep into it, you're like, okay, we're here, we're doing it, or were there moments where you guys just because I mean, it's like he's one of the most influential folks of modernity of the 20th century, like, oh my goodness, and this isn't the manifesto, like this is the big boy, right? This is capital, right? Das Kapital. So I mean, how did you guys feel doing this? I mean, you must have felt the weight of it and expectation and anxiety, I'm assuming. No?
Well, there's a line in Kafka I like a lot where he says that he combines a great ability to think psychoanalytically with an even greater ability not to think psychoanalytically. And, something like that, I think, applied here. So we were very aware of the way in which Marx scholarship often works and the importance that people attach to individual usages. And as people who are devoted to critical analysis of textual exegesis, we appreciate that a lot, but it can burden you when you're doing this kind of work. And so I think it makes sense to be careful with words like nature, given the current interest that people have in Marx's ecological thinking, for example, and not to use that word when Marx doesn't use nature or some form of it in German. The German word for nature is also essentially nature. On the other hand, if you're translating with an imaginary Marxologist on your shoulder, that's just a recipe for a failed translation. You have to at times, while proceeding thoughtfully and carefully, just let go a little bit and not if you're translating, in other words, defensively, probably the results are not going to be good. If you're translating to avoid certain kinds of criticisms, the results are not going to be good. And, frankly, you're very vulnerable when you're a translator. There's always a gap between the source text and the translation. There has to be. And if people want to proceed in gotcha mode and act as though like any gap between what's in the source text and what's in the translation is a grave flaw, they can do that. You can take the best translation and expose these gaps right away. And if you want to act as if these things are all problems, then, you can do that. I mean, it's a unproductive, small-hearted exercise, but people do it. And it took a little while, I suppose, to come to terms with that. But at this point, we
it's out there.
we have come to terms with it. Yes, yes, it's out there. And
can I just add something to Reiter's account? A couple of things. I think this is an edition that seeks to make a lot of these choices transparent through a very rigorous set of editorial notes at the back. So when you make a certain choice, and keep in mind that there's been 50 years since the last translation, and a lot of those terms have become technical terms in English language Marxism, like primitive accumulation, for example, which everyone always knew was not the best way to translate ursprüngliche Akkumulation. We have changed it to original accumulation. Even that has its problems because of what Marx means by that term later, but we accompany it with a long note which explains the back and forth. This is the real benefit of a later translation. It can see where decisions have been made that narrowed things. I also think previous translations came out of certain doctrinaire moments, and neither of us is a Marxist in any classical sense. So we try to open up for many possible interpretations and give people the tools to go back to the German in the notes, we do that so they can encounter the controversies themselves.
And, I think retranslation is on one level a lot like scholarship. It's a conversation, a running conversation. And so, it's not, of course, going to be the last word here. It responds in some ways critically to previous translations, and people want to respond critically to this translation and further translations. I think that's great. On the other hand, it is a text by Marx that's also a text by me, and with a lot of help from Paul. And that is a weird thing. And it's, I think, more daunting when the author is someone of Marxist stature to do that, to be choosing words for Marx, which is essentially what you're doing, choosing words that will go under Marx's name, which is essentially what you're doing. And so there were times when I paused to think about that and the weirdness of it, and it didn't, for whatever reason, it didn't hold me up too much. Probably there's something wrong with me. It should have.
No, I don't think so at all.
It would have been more difficult to get past.
Yeah.
Maybe it was that other people didn't seem to be trying. People had a lot of opportunity, 50 years nearly, to retranslate this, and it seemed like there were takers. So I thought, okay, well, we're qualified to do this in interesting ways, I think. And with our expertise in German Jewish intellectual history, not being devoted to any particular argument about Marx, as I bring up a bit in the footnotes to my translator's preface, and Paul has talked about a couple of times. We have expertise in German Jewish voices in this construction of an outsider-insider perspective that uses a lot of irony, mockery as well, that specializes in deconstructing the arguments of others fiercely, that also has a social justice commitment. We have an expertise in this that a lot of people doing Marx translation don't have, and we think it's very relevant here.
I had a conversation with Damien Searles. I'm sure you've heard the name, of course, or maybe know him. And we had a conversation, and I say a good half of that conversation was about kind of his philosophy of translation. It's very interesting. It was very, very interesting, his outlook. There's a lot of what you said I can hear in what he said, but also a lot of divergence as well. He's very much of the kind of, look, you do what you want. It's your translation. You should obviously know language and you should be respectful to the text, but you're not inside the author's head. You never will be, and it is your perspective of how to translate it, which is such an interesting take. And so I think that in some ways is probably not entirely wrong, but I can imagine the weight of Marx and wanting to get it right is important. Which to my next point is, you guys use it says it in the beginning, tell me if I get this wrong, it's the first time that the second German edition has been translated into English. I got that right? That's correct, right? Yes. So there was a first German, the original, the first German edition. So the second German edition was never in English until this one.
The first German edition hasn't been translated into English either, only the first chapter.
Okay.
So the existing English translations are based on the third edition and the fourth edition, both of which appeared after Marx's death.
I see. So the second one was while he was still alive.
Exactly. This is the last German edition whose publication Marx himself oversaw.
So what makes this second edition different from the subsequent editions and or the first edition? And how did that, I guess, impact or influence some of the decisions you both made on translation and maybe other ancillary kinds of decisions there?
Well, the second German edition is the last one that Marx actually saw through to publication. That's not fully true because he participated heavily in a French translation just after this one came out. or as it was coming out. And he saw that one through to publication as well. There's really three contestants for good sources for translation. There's the first German edition, the second German edition, and the French translation. And they're all different. I think of the German editions, the second German edition, I know this can get mind-bogglingly complicated. In fact, it seems like this volume is just a very small part of a massive set of manuscripts, out of which come volume 1, 2, and 3, which are published. Volumes 2 and 3 were reconstructed by Marx's friend Engels, who's worth talking about in his own right. Quite a good editor, quite faithful to his friend, certainly passionate about the project of the emancipation of labor and of transforming the economic system. But volume 1, the second edition, has some very significant changes from the first edition, mainly the discussions of the value form in the first 4 chapters. And those are preserved in the second edition, and those you will get in this translation. The other English translations are from the third and fourth editions in German, which were put together by Engels. And so they have decisions in them that were not Marx's. They can be evaluated independently. People have become accustomed to them when reading English, but this is the one that has Marx's imprimatur. And we should say also that of these 3 later editions, 2, 3, and 4, they're substantially the same. The differences are minor, in some cases theoretically significant, but they don't change the basic theory.
Yeah, there's some movement. 2 and 3 are very similar. There's a bit more movement between 2 and 4. Engels in the 4th edition of the first volume of Capital, he integrated more of the changes that Marx had made for the French edition. And there are some passages where, you do feel like you're not reading Marx. It's not really Marx's, because Engels translated this French material into German and inserted it into the 4th edition. So it's Engels's translation of Marx's French translation of Marx's text, except that Marx wasn't the only one who worked on that French translation. Somebody else did the translation, and then Marx heavily revised that translation. So there's more of a difference, but the biggest difference I would say is between the first edition and the second edition, because Marx did a tremendous amount of revising between those 2 editions, and some of the more famous parts of the text, like the fetish section, are in an appendix in the first edition, and so there's a big difference there.
What?
For sure.
We should say,
Go ahead.
Sorry. Oh, we should say too that the important parts of the French translation are included in an appendix in this edition, and there's an essay following it about the interesting stuff in the French translation.
French translation is a bit of a philological black box. Some people really hold up the French edition as the authentic Capital. After all, this is Marx's last word. This is the last edition whose publication he oversaw, not the last German edition. That's the source text that we used, but the last edition of Capital, whose publication process he oversaw. And he says at one point in the preface, I believe, to that, or a little prefatory note, he says that it has its own independent scientific value. In other words, he revised as he was translating. So it's not just translation, it's a mixture of translation and revision. And he produced these lists that he wanted Engels, to use for future editions of Capital, where passages from the French edition would be integrated into those future editions. Engels did some of that for the 3rd and 4th German editions of Capital, but the lists are unruly, very hard to use. And when people talk about the gains made in the French edition, the gains over the second German edition, they point to passages that aren't actually on Marx's lists. And in some cases, I'm a little skeptical of some of those claims. In some cases, the argument that Marx was revising there doesn't seem so persuasive to me. It looks like translation rather than revision. And so you then wonder about whether this is in fact, whether the passage in question is in fact reflecting or does in fact reflect a change in Marx's thinking. That's the idea, that this reflects the latest in Marx's thinking, because Marx wasn't a big reviser of his ideas. And no doubt he did change his thinking about the capitalist production process in some important ways between 1872, when the second German edition came out, in 1875, when the French edition was all finished. But you still have to really show that that's the case, and I don't think that it's, from what I've seen, been done that well in those pieces that attempt to show that the French edition is the authentic, the real edition, the latest edition that reflects major changes in Marxist thinking.
I wanted to ask about that. What do you feel is lost? So, Marx is German. German is his primary language, but what do you feel gets lost, if anything? I mean, German to English isn't obviously a one-to-one. You're going to have to do some some creative translating, I would imagine, of some things. What do you think gets lost in the English translation and the French translation if you don't know the original German? Is it, this is probably the thing, right, of translation. Like, this is what, you got to make those decisions. What's the essence? What was he trying to say? But since you guys know German and you have been able to translate and know English and all this, what do you feel gets lost, or what do you think can be maybe expanded upon, or what do you think is, I guess, those differences between English or German, English, and French, I guess?
So I'll say two things. One is that German has a reputation for being a language of distension, where you have very long sentences and you have very long words. But in fact, it's also a language that lends itself to compression. And Marx takes full advantage of that. This is in part a function of gendered nouns, which allows you to keep track of what pronouns refer to more readily than you can in English, and also inflection, case endings, this kind of thing. So German to English translations, they tend to get significantly longer than the German source text. And translations in general tend to get longer than the source text, because you're trying to work in context that the original audience wouldn't necessarily need, so that readers can understand. But there are other reasons, including the ones I just named. And so there's a lot of powerful compression in Marx's text that's very hard to retain. And that's something that gets lost. And maybe something that goes along with that is that it's also very hard to retain ambiguity at the level on which you encounter it in the source text. Often you have to decide, is this going to be more ambiguous or less ambiguous? And there are advantages and disadvantages, to those routes, either, or there are advantages to the one route, there are advantages to the other route, there are disadvantages to the two routes as well. If you make things less ambiguous, then there's more of your interpretation in there. It's stronger translation, and there's less room for the reader to figure things out for themselves. If there's more ambiguity, then the obvious disadvantage is that it can be very hard to know, what is he talking about here? And so there are a lot of moments of compressed German language where there's a certain level of ambiguity, and if you try to retain the compression, the ambiguity goes up. If you make things a little clearer, you go in with strong translation, then you lose the compression. And also, there's a loss there. The reader has less room to figure things out on their own. There's some words, very important words, that come up a lot in the German that don't have great matches in English, and it's hard to retain the ambiguity there as well. So these are some things off the, as there are also just a lot of individual statements he makes that were difficult to translate, and I felt that something didn't carry over so well. But generally speaking, these were significant challenges for me, the translator, and for Paul, who was part of these conversations about how to proceed.
I could add something here very briefly. I was involved in the translation at a certain stage, but this is a human being, Paul Reitter, who sat for 2 years, going sentence by sentence, really an amazing accomplishment. I think there's a category that we should invent found in translation. There is a certain affinity that every translator has for certain traits or aspects of a book or of an author. And Reitter has affinities for several of them in Marx that I think have been missing in English translations. One is the humor, for sure. One is the directness of Marx's prose, which previous translations I found, having taught them a lot, have been overly dialectical, I would say. It's as though you get this idea, dialectics, it's great. And then you want everything to be dialectical or turn around dialectics. But Marx had a number of modes. There's a great book called Marx's Styles, Ludovico Silva, in which he lays out all the different styles that Marx uses. He was totally ecumenical about attacking the bourgeoisie and attacking the capital system. He would use anything, insults, obscure literary references, metaphors, every sort of Jeremiad possible, inventing dialogues, making commodities speak for themselves. And Paul, being a literary person, he really opens up. So I think he opens up all those different modes, many more than have been in other translations. There's a lot found in this translation that was lost in others.
Yeah.
I mean, you can only translate what you hear, and everybody comes to the text with a different frame of reference that's going to influence what they hear. As I mentioned, I have this background in working on German Jewish writers who have some affinities with Marx, one of them being Karl Kraus. Karl Kraus was very critical of other German Jewish writers, and for that reason associated with Jewish self-hatred. And once some other German Jewish writer, Franz Werfel, thought that he had caught Kraus out using a Yiddishism. And Kraus explained that this was actually an archaism, not a Yiddishism. But then he said, if it had been a Yiddishism, so what? My language squeaks with all the noises of the world. And there's that in Capital as well. It's a text that tries to squeak with all the noises of the world. And maybe I heard some things with that idea in mind, because I think that there are some significant affinities between Kraus and Marx. A little more attuned to that than some of the other translators, possibly.
So, I mean, I find all of this really, really, really important, because I think that with translation and with a new edition, part of I guess you could say, the big deal of this is all of these things of a new translation of a monumental book is important for understanding what Marx's Capital Volume 1 is for the 21st century, and why that's important, and understanding it in this way of now, as opposed to feeling more a little bit archaic in some ways. And so I find all of this very, very important. There's something that I think, North, you had written this bit, and so I mean, both of you can pitch in here, but I think the credit goes to you, North, at least in the book. In this introduction about Marx and some element of like a psychological profile here. You talk about his anger and what motivated him. And so maybe just tell us a little bit before we get into, kind of the big themes and stuff in the book, in Capital. What was his kind of, as best we know, inner psychology, his motives? How much was anger and resentment a factor motivating him here? How did that go from against individuals to like the system, the big political system? What was he so angry about? And what other elements were in there? I mean, anger is one thing, but maybe what were some of the other elements? Really, what was motivated and driving him to kind of make these big ideas on the critiques of a political economy?
I guess sometimes in history, someone is just pissed and they go out and do something and it changes the course of history. It's not exactly the case with Marx. I did start out the introduction, the editor's introduction to the volume, talking about Marx's anger, but we can situate it a little bit. Marx was born at a time where the revolutionary promise of Europe had really disappeared. But people remembered the promise. They remembered the French Revolution. They were experiencing the afterlife of a very conservative society of orders, a very fragmented German state, kind of overrun by Prussian might, and the lack of freedoms we consider to be basic, liberal freedoms even. He also lived the failed promise for Jews in Germany who, left the ghettos, but then really couldn't enter public life in the same way because of restrictions. So his father, who came from a lineage of rabbis, famously converted so he could continue in his post as a social servant, a civil servant. And so Marx was in a kind of mode where he lived in a context in which the promises of freedom and the promises of advancement were not for him. So I would say his anger was historically and socially conditioned, however psychological it was. But he was also, pissed. And he got pissed particularly when he started to do some journalism in the early 1840s, keeping in mind that he was, 25, more or less, really young, that the poor were being treated increasingly badly in German-speaking lands. And he wrote a set of scathing articles about the so-called theft of wood cases, in which people who had no other means, who would pick up, glean wood in the forests that belonged to the prince or that belonged to the state, were being dispossessed of this last freedom that they had. The wood was being claimed as private property belonging to the landowners, when actually the rights to glean had been assumed, sometimes written, but also assumed for hundreds of years. So suddenly you couldn't pick up wood in the forest and make a broom or light your fire with it. And what Marx did was he was pissed at the situation, but he understood the way the law was being used to extend private property, and he started to get really furious at the law and its representatives. And he took what his milieu was calling critique, and he turned it into what he called in a letter to his friend Arnold Ruge, the ruthless critique of everything standing. He really thought the system was rotten to its core, and he set out to map it. So from being angry at a situation which was unfair and maybe having a moral stance, he turned towards something like analysis of a structure. And that was the beginning of his critical career.
Reitter, anything you want to add here?
I would say that some other relevant circumstances here on the personal level have to do with the sense of himself that he developed very early on, that he was and is encouraged by his parents. His mother, I think, used to refer to him as something like the darling of fortune, that he was intellectually gifted beyond other people, even though there wasn't necessarily a great deal of evidence for this always. He tried his hand at writing poetry and failed rather miserably, as biographers always like to point out. They really like to dwell on the poor, what they perceive to be the poor quality of his poetry. It seems a little mean. He was a young guy, give him a break.
Right.
How many people really, make it in that game? In any case, so he had a strong sense of himself as having extraordinary intellectual gifts, and it was pretty early on that did get outside recognition beyond the family in the intellectual circles in which he moved. His university circle at the University of Berlin, he was at Bonn, and then he was at Berlin. Wasn't such a serious student at Bonn. Berlin, he really started to devote himself to ideas, and he hung around with a crowd of people, left-leaning Hegelian people influenced by Hegel, critical of Hegel, but influenced by Hegel, young Hegelians. And it was pretty clear to them that Marx was unusual in his intellectual capacities. And then when he got his first job outside of school, got his PhD, actually from the University of Vienna, but it was kind of a mail-in deal. And he went from Berlin to Cologne and worked for a new newspaper, left-leaning newspaper with a complicated political orientation and position. Marx helped to make it into more of a left-leaning organ, and the writings that Paul was talking about were written for this Rheinische Zeitung, the Rheinische newspaper. Marx pretty quickly rose to become the editor of that newspaper, even though he was extremely young at the time. And people just recognized, okay, this guy is, as people would say today, he's different. And it took a long time for that recognition to be shared more widely. And so this is, of course, a blueprint for writerly bitterness and anger, someone who is gifted beyond other people, but not getting the same level of recognition necessarily, seeing less gifted people get a lot more recognition. Someone like his friend, but also rival, Ferdinand Lassalle, for example. And this bothered Marx, and it's maybe one of the reasons why he was very quick to feud with people, to have friendships, but then fall out with people. The friendship with Engels is really, in a way, an amazing thing for it's never really having featured any kind of significant intellectual falling out. There was a strained moment when Marx responded not very sensitively to the news that Engels' longtime partner, Mary Burns, had died. And that, I think, is the closest they ever came to having a real falling out. So Marx was, he spent a lot of time living in desperate material straits, incredible hardship in the family, children dying, in his household dying. It's pretty clear from things having to do with these desperate material circumstances, the food not being great, not having access to the best doctors, this sort of thing being contributing factors. And I think all of this, helped, all of this contributed to Marx's irascibility. The fundamental thing was this sense of just grave injustice and waste that now you have. This is an idea that Marx came to early on and never really abandoned, as to my knowledge, that capitalism had created incredible productivity, productive power, that there was now the capacity to have everyone live in relative material well-being. And yet what was happening? Something very, very different. People were working more than they had in the past, even though they had the productive capacities that would allow people not to work as much and to enjoy much more in the way of, again, material well-being. And he was very committed to the idea that, we can do better, and that we can have a form of social organization that promotes human flourishing much more than the capitalist order, whose merits he was, very quick to recognize, and recognized more eloquently, more stirringly than a lot of people in the Communist Manifesto and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, what do you both make of this interesting thing? Before we kind of dive into details of Capital, what does this distinguish? How do we distinguish between Marx's thought and his impact? Right. This is a little bit more kind of an abstract, 30,000-foot kind of question, but I want to do it at the forefront. But when we talk about things like labor theory of value and things like that, and commodities, like, how do we make that distinction? Because I feel like a lot of the times, even for myself as well, at points I feel like gotten that mixed up. And there's what he thought, but then there's this kind of like this huge impact he has on the world and on economics and different type of theory. And how do we understand the differences, if there are differences here? Either one of you.
It's a hard question. In a way, it's the key question after 150 years and some big political movements, nation-changing political movements that have evoked Marx's name. Mostly people say, how do we read Marx after really existing socialisms no longer really exist? And I think that's part of your question. And the other part is, I would say, the myth. How do you separate Marx from the myth and Capital from the Marx myth? Because Capital is really in the details. A highly technical book. It's very complicated. It really is analytic rather than predictive. It doesn't tell you how things are going to end. Unlike the Communist Manifesto, which doesn't either really, it calls upon you to help history towards a certain end. I think you have to say that, the good in Marx's impact is really in Marx's his recognition that the capital system is like nothing that has been seen before in recorded human history. B, it has to be taken on its own terms and understood. And C, it's full of contradictions that don't really make sense, and other discourses that claim to present it in a simple way are wrong. That's really what's driving all of the impact anyway. That this is a view of the way things are that can help us, as Reitter said, that can eventually help us live better. The question whether you can live better by knowing more in the most excruciating detail the chains you're in, that is a question that has to be developed. How do you get from knowing those chains to either living better within the chains or releasing the chains? That's where a lot of the people who have received Marx disagree.
Reitter?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I'll just add that the legacy of what a friend of ours, Michael Heinrich, calls worldview Marxism, by which he means the version of Marxist thought that was that obtained, or that's not really the right word, that was used in Marxist states, the Soviet Union, for example, as a founding set of ideas around which society was supposed to be organized and which justified that organization. That I think persists in some ways. There's been a lot of talk about how we've moved on from that, and a lot of talk in Marxist studies about how we recognize that Marxism isn't this closed system, the totality that it was seen to be under worldview Marxism, or for people who were advancing worldview Marxism, but rather something very fluid, always in progress. And I think that's exciting that that's been embraced as much as it has. But I think that it would be interesting to try to look closely at the ways in which worldview Marxism persists amid all of this change. I was surprised to get a question from somebody who was doing an interview with us about how capital is generally seen as a call for revolution, and you don't see it that way. And well, basically, what's up with that? And my feeling about that question is it's like kind of a worldview Marxist perspective on capital. And if you read Capital, you don't really find a call for revolution in there at all. There's some talk about how the capitalist system might collapse, and you can say that there's an implied call for revolution because its general take on the capitalist system is that it can't be changed in such a way that things would be fundamentally more humane. If you have capitalism, you're going to have exploitation, immiseration, environmental destruction that in the end is not really sustainable. So, if the capitalist system doesn't collapse under the weight of its own contradictions and you do nothing, then you're doomed. And you can say that maybe, well, that's an implied call for revolution. But there isn't the kind of call for revolution that you have in the Communist Manifesto, Workers of the World Unite. Under worldview capitalism, that's how it was read. That's how it was talked about. So this, to me, is an example of that thinking persisting in amid this environment of thinking of Marx in different terms. And so I think that you, in conversations, very intellectual conversations about Marx that don't necessarily want to link to some kind of social action immediately or see themselves linking to some kind of social action immediately, even there, you have some of this. And so that we'll see, how it, where it persists, how it persists.
If somebody were to ask you, I'm going to put two questions here together. If somebody were to ask you, okay, guys, you spent a handful of years, you've a career out of understanding elements of Marx. Obviously, you look at other things as you guys did earlier, but you spent time with Marx and Capital and translating and researching all this. What's it about? Like, what's he saying? Give me the elevator pitch. What is the 2-minute condensed 600 or 700 pages? But like, what's the thesis here? What's he saying? What's the big thrust of it? And what would you say is his most insightful critique of economic history?
No problem.
It's like Hegel meets Adam Smith.
Yeah,
I got a Hegel question for you later, so I'll save that for you. I got that coming up.
Well, mostly what he does is peel back. Remember that the subtitle is Critique of Political Economy. The way to get to a better account of capitalism was to peel back the layers of these misleading understandings. I won't say false because they have a lot of elements of truth to them, which Marx learned from and which allowed him to overcome Hegel's view of the social, really through classical political economy, through Ricardo, more than anyone. The one sentence version is capitalism's ills will persist. People will suffer, not just the workers, but the capitalists, because they're also enchained to a system that is not good for them in the long run because of what he calls the capital relation. Because capitalists hold back the means of production from the workers who are the only ones who can use it, and the workers have to sell themselves to the capitalists in order to carry out their natural capacities.
Reitter?
Stop that, Reitter.
Yes. Well, I think that was a great answer, Paul. Paul is wonderful at talking about this book, and I'm not going to offer any sort of critique of what he just said, only that this inevitably leads to disappointment trying to summarize the argument of capital, because really the strength of the book is, for me at least, showing how the system works. That's where he's going so far beyond what existing political economy had done. He keeps asking these questions that they haven't asked and tries to work out the answers, which involve, again, a lot of not simply making an argument, but showing how different things in the system relate to one another to produce certain effects and often deform relationships.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
We should say, too, that this is volume 1. And in fact, volume 2 is from a very different perspective. It's on the circulation process. And volume 3 is a kind of overview of money and credit and the system as a whole. So that epitome that I gave, which is more like the core, and Paul is right, describing its effects, the core of capitalism's effects on workers, on the length of the working day, on the intensity of work, on the way populations get thrown out of work, the expansion of capital into areas in which it hasn't expanded, called colonization, imperialism. All of those things are the consequences. In a way, that's where you get to see our world. So you can't really, the elevator pitch, you want to get out of the elevator and go into the lecture hall and read the rest of the book.
There you go.
But again, 2 and 3 are absolutely integral, and they have different core arguments. And those arguments all link together. Unfortunately, when it comes to a global social system, and someone with this kind of intelligence, as Marx had, the note of all of this, the flavor of all of this is complexity, not simplicity. So every time you say one thing, it moves you to another thing.
I want to ask about the theory of labor, but I do want to bring up Hegel. This is sort of a big question. So, tell us, I guess, if you can, a little bit, just for context, about dialectical materialism and how that compares with Hegel's progressive history, and how that's going up against, or how that's in tandem or in concert with Marx's understanding or theory of history. So the reason I bring it up is because, well, I think the materialism piece is obviously relevant, but Hegel was tremendous, and many people have seen that link between Hegel's philosophy and obviously Marx's critique. So yeah, just try to bridge that gap for us. Whoever wants to start, with Hegel first, I guess. But connect that for me.
Paul's stronger on Hegel than I am, so he should take this one or start.
I can start. Oh, it's a big topic and a complicated topic. The places to look for it in Marx are not really in Capital, Volume 1, but you can look in the afterword to the second edition, which is in our translation, in which he talks about his allegiance to Hegel, limited allegiance to Hegel and Hegel's logic, although his version will be dialectics turned back onto its feet, since Hegel turned it on its head. This is a very multifarious metaphor, turning something on its head. For Marx, it means not only that it's upside down, but that it's focused on ideas that are in the head, as opposed to social relations, needs, and productive capacities that keep people living, basically. So to turn it onto its feet means to turn it onto labor. And then, just for people who want to do more study, dialectical materialism, which, by the way, is not a Marxian term. It's not even really an Engelsian term, although Engels, you could say, definitely does dialectical materialism. These things have been called dialectical materialism afterwards. You look in the preface to Marx's contribution to the Critique of Political Economy from 1859, and there you have the famous passage, "In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production." That is like the rallying cry of dialectical materialism. That is, there are these material relations, which means social relations mediated by making the means of living, which take different forms at different epochs. This is the historical side of it. And at every epoch, there are a set of contradictions that arise. I make this thing, but I don't get to use it. That's a basic contradiction in any society larger than Robinson Crusoe, right? I have to give this thing up to, even my kids. I'm like, I made dinner and they ate it all. This is a contradiction. To capitalism, in which there are many, many contradictions, the difference from Hegel's dialectic is there is not any kind of harmonious progress in which the contradictions are overcome just through the logic of history. The contradictions are pretty intractable, especially in capitalism, much more intractable. And it isn't clear to Marx how they will be overcome, except maybe by a total revolution or by the dictatorship of the proletariat, which then decides on a different social form. But there is no internal movement of a dialectic, automatic dialectic in Marx.
Reitter, anything you want to jump in here on? Or?
I would just add that there are a couple of ways of talking about Marx's dialectical approach, and that on some level there is a strong dialectical historical sensibility in Marx, even when he's doing mini histories, like telling the history of English factory legislation. You can see that there's a lot of back and forth. There's this action that produces a reaction that produces another reaction. It's not. He did not have a mind that worked in a linear way when it came to the way that he perceived history. And you can talk about that maybe as some effect of his dialectical training as a student who at one point became very enthusiastic about Hegel and then distanced himself from Hegel, but in some ways in Hegelian way, and then wrote a number of critiques of Hegel early on in his career, and was influenced by Ludwig Feuerbach and his theory of alienation that was in a way a critical response to Hegel. In any case, you can talk about it in those terms. I kind of think on some level, this was something very, very basic to the way that Marx's mind worked, and that you would have seen it had he not encountered Hegel as he did. Obviously, I can't prove this counterfactual, but in my I guess, based on my experience of Marx and how he thinks and approaches things, I feel this to be so.
Well, it was de rigueur for his group. Hegel was so alien and it's like learning a language, really. Something like everyone around Marx was speaking, I don't know, pick a language that I don't know, just randomly, Japanese. They were all speaking Japanese, and he had to learn Japanese, and he really did learn the dialectic. That's what that's how they were explaining everything. In fact, in his legal education, one of Hegel's students, Eduard Ganz, who had learned how law works from Hegel's philosophy of right, was one of Marx's teachers and was the leading light of that circle. So everything was explained dialectically. And if you didn't conform your thinking to that, you couldn't really converse with anyone in those years of the late 30s and early 40s. It was like an educational deformation. Like people who were educated, like myself, in deconstruction, you learn to think in a particular way. It's amazing, actually, how he came back around to it after rejecting it in the 50s. There's a funny letter in which he says, as I was leafing through Hegel's logic, I realized there's something to this, which, I mean, is just ludicrous.
Right. It fell out of favor, Hegelian philosophizing did, and Marx, there's a certain protectiveness toward it in Marx. He doesn't like what he considers to be crude criticisms of Hegel. And I guess there is this question about affinity and whether Marx had some affinity for this that he brought to it that allowed him to excel in it in ways that other people didn't. Ganz is someone who should get more attention than he does, for sure. He died pretty young. I think he was 39 or 40 of a stroke, as he was really coming into his own as a legal scholar. And one of Marx's biographers, Jonathan Sperber, who he is generally he's trying to diminish Marx's reputation in some ways, thinks that Marx is and unjustly viewed as a kind of prophetic figure, when in fact he's very much a 19th century figure, an early 19th century figure, in fact, and he's trying to put Marx back into the 19th century. And he also tries in many ways to suggest Marx is less original as a thinker than he is often thought to be. And one thing that Sperber does is to try to show that a lot of the ideas in the Communist Manifesto having to do with this dialectical vision of history actually come from Ganz. And he does a close comparative analysis of some of Ganz's writings written before the Communist Manifesto and the Communist Manifesto, and because Ganz had been dead for some time by then. And it's tendentious, but it's not uninteresting or always unpersuasive, I would say.
It is worth saying, now that you mentioned the Communist Manifesto, that the spirit there, which is different than Hegel's spirit, the spirit of communism, which they were calling upon, they were calling for it to be concretized in political action, to not remain a spirit anymore. That's a very Hegelian idea, and Gantz thought of the progress of society in that way too, would be concretized in better laws. This is the way Hegel's philosophy of right puts it. All of that pretty much is out the window when you get to capital. There's no sense that a spirit is going to win out. The best that Marx can do is talk about how workers who end up making, like in Adam Smith's pin factory, where you're like the tip chiseler on a pin, as opposed to the head hammerer and the wire extruder. Because you all have to work together, you develop something new, which is called cooperation. And out of that, he's hoping that the proletariat can learn to organize itself in a different way. There's a sense of the master-slave dialectic working there a little bit, but it's much diminished to what I think of as the pessimistic side of the book, which describes the unbending nature of capitalism.
So a big part in the book is he spends time and emphasizes labor and value, and these two together. So he has his labor theory of value. And you talk about these two types, or he does, I should say, but you show that he has these two types of use value and value, especially when talking with commodities. What is it about, I guess, if you were to kind of, in a way, I mean, some of this is a little bit hard to get through, and as you said, it's very technical. What is this labor theory of value that he's trying to put forward, and how does that explain value in kind of contemporary capitalism, I guess?
I can take the first part of the question, and maybe we'll split it up. So this labor theory of value goes back to Hobbes, at least, and runs through Adam Smith and Ricardo. This is not something that Marx invented, and basically it's the idea that the value of a product is determined by the labor that went into producing it. And Marx is very proud of himself for making some significant advances here. One of them being that there isn't just the concrete labor that produces a useful object, that there is also abstract labor, and that really it's abstract human labor that produces value. The whole point of value is that it allows very diverse things to be exchanged. It's the thing that they have in common, the thing that's commensurate. And so if the labor that produces them is all different labor, then you're not going to have this commensurability. The commensurability comes about through equal human labor. And it's objectified equal human labor that is value. That's one way in which Marx defines value. Where does this equal human labor get expended exactly? Well, that's something that people argue over. And one influential theory holds that it only really comes into being at the moment of exchange. It's the product of a process of abstraction, the stripping away of all the things that make commodities different to get to this point where they can be equated to one another. And that process of abstraction, according to one influential theory of how this works, happens in exchange, at the moment of exchange. And that's where value really comes about. But Marx often talks about value as though it's something that's produced alongside the product in a labor process that, like all kinds of things under capitalism, has a double character. Right? So a commodity is, as you said, it's a double thing. It's a use value, and it's also value, or a value thing, is how Marx talks about it. Labor under capitalism, and this only goes for capitalism, this regime of value. Marx thinks that other systems of production are much more transparent. He's very aware of how uncanny and strange this sounds. He plays that up as a way of underscoring how unnatural capitalism is. And it's then for him a great irony and perversity that political economists are always trying to present it as being in line with our natural way of doing things, since according to them, well, what are we programmed to do? Unlike animals, barter, truck, barter, and exchange, according to Adam Smith. But for Marx, this is not at all the case. And so you have the commodity, it's a double thing, a physical thing and a non-physical value thing. You have labor, that's concrete labor and also abstract labor. And you have the labor process, that's the process of producing a commodity, a physical thing, but is also, Marx calls it, the process where value is created. So he talks in terms that make you think that value could well be created outside of exchange. And of course, you don't have value without the expenditure of actual concrete labor. And it can be very then, there is therefore room for debate here. And in any case, what the classical political economists didn't come up with were, well, a number of things. One of them, they didn't come up with this idea that the labor that produces value is abstract labor. And they also didn't come up with the idea that that this value, that they didn't think as nearly as much as Marx did about the social character of value. And for Marx, the value is measured in terms of not just labor time, but socially necessary labor time. Value is, there's always a social average involved here, so that if it takes you 10 hours to produce a chair, but society only needs, the social average is 8 hours, then it's the value of the chair that takes you 10 hours to produce is actually only 8 hours of social labor. And that was also something that he brought into the mix. And one of the, I think, powerful things about the book is the way that Marx shows how capitalism, as it insists more and more on the notion of individual private property, it becomes more and more a social system. And he's very interested in showing how that works.
There does seem like it's I wouldn't say person-centered, but the person is definitely there behind what the labor is, right? That this is, somebody did this, there's a certain amount of hours, and then you're turning it into some kind of value, right? Like there's a person that's doing this, right? Later in the book, he talks about this cooperative component, right? And how he sees cooperation within an economic system, which is really interesting. You could touch on that here, but North, you want to?
Right, that's another way in which capitalist privatization, the concentration of resources in the hands of individual people, leads to a kind of social, what he'll talk about is a socialization of labor, which increases productivity and in various ways, in part by, as Marx puts it, inciting the animal spirits that people have when they're working next to inciting animal spirits, our animal spirits, in a way that only happens when we're working side by side. It doesn't happen when we're working alone. But sometimes these terms are a little misleading. It's not like this cooperation. We think of cooperation as a good thing. This kind of cooperation is not something that Marx is necessarily enthusiastic about. He isn't. He recognizes its upsides, but it also has to do with, or it also involves, a narrowing of the labor process, specialization, which that's an area, that's a term that doesn't really match up as well as one would hope with the term in German, which Marx, which a more direct but somewhat confusing translation for would be partial labor. Marx, this idea of the division of labor in German is Teilung der Arbeit, and Teil has to do with part, and Marx really runs with this Teilung. So he talks about the partial worker and partial labor, and the labor that happens under cooperation more and more becomes partial labor, and it's specialized in the sense of narrow, but not in the sense of like some kind of labor that necessarily requires a great deal of higher expertise, which is how we use specialization of labor, which is why it's not ideal as a translation, but nevertheless the best that I could come up with. In any event, this cooperation involves a deformation of us, because he thinks that this narrowing does bring about a deformation in people. It turns them into freaks, as he says at one point. Paul, how was that account of the labor theory of value?
Chime in here, North. What are your thoughts? You can disagree with Reitter here if he's off.
2.5 stars.
It's just a very hard topic that's suffused with a lot of myth. Certain mainstream economists tend to assimilate Marx to Ricardo and think of him as being a proponent of something they call the labor theory of value, which you could use with some truth about Ricardo, who was looking for what made prices tick. We know that prices if you look at prices, they're really chaotic. They might go up and up and up and up with no reason. They might go down and down and down and down with no reason. Everyone wants to know what causes prices to fluctuate. And Ricardo had an idea, which he shared with Smith, but developed, that it had to do with the amount of time an individual took physically to make modifications to a natural thing. So however much, it had to do with the modifications to a natural thing that a human being put into it, but it was only calculable based on the amount of time they spent, which is complicated because, of course, you can spend time lazily, you can spend time more intensely. All of those things are complications in what you could call the labor theory of value, which can be ascribed to Ricardo. Marx didn't have a labor theory of value. He seems like he does at times because he's really interested in what workers do in the workshop. But as Reitter said, exactly right, that
I'm good about myself now.
There you go. That might be the only time I'll ever say that. That I certainly never say that to graduate students. Is that Marx is interested in, I would call it value as a norm of exchange. This is how I would put it. This is how people have put it, and the real great American writer on this is Diane Elson from the late 70s, I believe, or early 80s, who wrote a paper on what she calls the value theory of labor. We don't have to get into that, but Marx is asking what makes things exchangeable for one another, even when prices go up and down. So if cotton is worth 10 and gold is worth 1,000, if gold becomes worth 2,000, cotton's going to become worth 20. So something in there keeps them in their ratio to one another, regardless of the fluctuation of prices, more or less. What stabilizes the ratios of exchange? And Marx calls this value, and he does not think it comes from the individual labor inputs of flesh and blood human beings, of their sweat and their muscle expenditures and their energies. He thinks it comes from the way those things are homogenized, packaged, and calculated by capitalism so you can exchange labor with one another. Labor has to become exchangeable with one another. So labor becomes homogenized, and that tells you, first of all, why things have a relatively stable ratio of exchange with one another, but also why labor, individual physical labor, is so fucked up, because you have to finish the thing in the abstract time that the market says you need to finish it in. So in addition to your labor being turned from the idea of abstract labor as a regulative norm, your labor being turned into from being a pin maker who has all this knowledge and skill to being the one who sharpens the head of the pin only and doesn't have to have much skill, to being someone who has to do that in a certain amount of time because the market demands it.
And if you can do it in less than that time, then you're increasing profits. So there's, pressure to beat the social average.
There's pressure, but the pressure comes from the social average, not from an individual capitalist's desire to make more profit. Again, there's this big abstract regime of control, which is these are what the values are. So you all have to hop to it. And you have to get this out in time because cotton is trading at 22 to 2000 or whatever it is. So for him, value is a norm of exchange. It affects the way laborers have to work. It's not something that they do. It explains why they have to rush, why they have to work more, because they have to keep the value up to where it's supposed to be in the exchange arena.
How does this fit with, I guess, more contemporary ideas we have about capitalism today? So I'm a little bit applying here a little bit, but in his day, in the 19th century, it was a little bit different. Now we have, in some ways, here in the United States, we live in a capitalist society. So on paper, sort of. But what do you think it is about how some of these ideas, in terms of his idea of how he views labor and value, in kind of a modern context, in a current context?
Well, your labor, wherever it is, will be determined by what the owner thinks is the time it should take you to get it done, so that you can get on to the next thing you need to get done, and they can make the profit they need to make. So again, capitalism has not changed in its core. The abstract idea of the abstraction of labor time as a norm of exchange determines how fast or slow or how much or how little you work. That's where capitalism turns former economic systems on their head.
It's very, very interesting. So there really isn't dramatic changes over time. The system is how it is, but you're talking about the social components and what your time is that you put into it. That stays the same. That whether you have more modern aspects of it or you're placed in a certain context, the idea of it is sort of the same. Yeah.
Yep.
And that's what
exactly
Marx
the same.
So Marx, for example, would be the last person to be surprised by companies that present themselves as pursuing a kind of enlightened capitalist agenda where they're trying to do something good for society, right? Tech companies talking about how we're going to change the world for the better, and then they turn out to be, at their core, pretty much exclusively profit-oriented, even after they've become incredibly wealthy. Marx's way of looking at the regime of value is such that he would find that completely unsurprising.
Yeah, and here's a good, simple example. Competition. Let's talk about competition. You're in an industry, you're making something. The boss says, hey, over there, they're making it in this amount of time. Either you do that or we're going to go under. So the character and the experience of working is not governed by, let's say, how everyone's skill in it, or how much we're going to enjoy what we make after we make it, but by the pressure to stay in business, competing with the next firm. And that hasn't changed at all. Once that changes, you will be in a non-capitalist system.
Okay, so my final question here is, Marx wrote this a while ago, about 150 years, give or take. And what do you think about the reality of, he didn't get everything right about capitalism, and a lot of the things that he said have not come true yet, or they're not exactly the same way. He's not Nostradamus. He's not looking into a crystal ball. He's not that. But I guess what can we say honestly about I guess sorts of kind of like a legacy question. Marx had a lot of really, really, influential ideas in Capital. Some people have tried to play that out in different ways. Doesn't work. Other people maybe in other ways has worked. But what do you think about what he kind of got right about capitalism and what he didn't get right or just kind of missed, even up to current day?
You're right that Marx was not in the business of predicting, although at some times in Capital and in other writings, he has what you could call a stagist view of history. He believes, kind of like Hegel did, that things will get better in stages and capitalism will be overcome. The more he analyzes capitalism, the more he finds that it is pretty intractable and that the way out of it isn't clear. So he certainly wasn't, by the time of Capital, making predictions about the end of capitalism. He did analyze capital in certain terms that people have disproven, and I think with good evidence, what's called the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is a theory of crisis, big crisis, and capitalists' collapse, has been shown to be faulty, although what it counts on is the idea that growth will slow the more that the investment in capital, that is in machinery especially, grows in relation to the investment in workers. This idea of slowing growth has been supported recently in all sorts of ways, especially by Thomas Piketty's book. So there's a lot of truth in that. Anyway, as I said, the labor theory of value isn't really Marx's theory. So you could say he got that wrong, but he was not a Ricardian ultimately. He moved away from that to think that value is a kind of fiction in the system that helps regulate exchange and forces workers to live up to the demands that the owners make on them to make more value for them. So I like to say Marx gave us the four X's: exploitation, extortion, extraction, and expropriation. And those are still the main gestures of capitalism. We have to understand, as Marx did, that capitalism feeds a globe, even though it also produces tremendous inequality, especially inequality of suffering. It isn't enough to analyze it and say, this is all a negative. It's hard to imagine, as people who study the Soviet Union, other places, systems that could feed such a huge population in partially in an efficient way. So the legacy, I think, is mixed.
Yeah.
This is still the best inner view and step towards a critique of capitalism. Remember, most people are still trying to become good capitalists in this system. Certainly in US America, they're trying to become good capitalists because that seems like the route to everyone's good. And Marx says the main lesson is that's impossible under capitalism. And that has not changed.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both Pauls, Reitter and North. You both were absolutely fantastic. The translation, as I said before, is really, really, really nice. It's very readable. I hadn't read Capital in a long time, and going back and rereading it, it was not as clunky as I remember it. So superb work you both did. And a big thanks for coming on and talking about such a monumental work. Your translation and editing and all the rest is just really invaluable. So big thanks for coming on and talking all about it.
Thanks for having us.